Good evening, I'm Hibaq Ahmed and this is an edition of news from Dalsan TV English broadcast with the latest news from Somalia and across the world. And these are some of our top news headlines. Parliament postpones session after gunmen besiege nearby hotel. University suspends graduation after gunmen besiege hotel close to graduation venue. And UN in Somalia calls for greater protection for women and girls during the humanitarian. Welcome to the broadcast. Security forces are battling to regain control of a hotel seized by members of militant group Al-Shabaab in the center of the capital Mogadishu on Sunday evening. At least 4 people have been killed and dozens more injured in the siege, which has lasted more than 14 hours. Multiple explosions and heavy gunfire could still be heard coming from the popular Villa Rose Hotel near the presidential palace. Fighters from the Al-Shabaab armed group have attacked a hotel used by government officials in the Somali capital of Mogadishu, according to police and government officials, with security officials saying the gunmen were wearing suicide vests. The attackers stormed the Villa Rose Hotel, which is close to the presidential palace, with explosive and guns, said police officer Mohammed Abdi on Sunday. It was not immediately clear how many attackers there were, he said. Some government officials at the Villa Rose were rescued after escaping from windows, said Abdi. The State Minister for the Environment, Adam O'Hersey, wrote on Twitter that he was safe after a terrorist explosion targeted at the State Minister for the Environment, Adam O'Hersey, wrote on Twitter that he was safe after a terrorist explosion targeted at my residence at the hotel where many government officials stay. Initial reports say that elite government forces had arrived on the scene and were actively fighting the militants inside the hotel. A Somali police spokesperson said it was not immediately clear how many Al-Shabaab fighters were involved in the attack. Al-Shabaab immediately claimed the attack through their media affiliates, who claimed to be targeting Villa Somalia. Al-Shabaab immediately claimed the attack through Al-Shabaab immediately claimed the attack through their media affiliates, who claimed to be targeting Villa Somalia. The Al-Qaeda-allied armed group fighting in Somalia for more than a decade is seeking to topple the country's central government and establish its own rule based on a strict interpretation of Islamic law. The group uses a campaign of bombings both in Somalia and elsewhere. And targets have included military installations as well as hotels, shopping centers, and busy traffic areas. Its fighters were driven out of Mogadishu in 2011 by the African Union peacekeeping forces. But it still controls swaths of Somalia's countryside and has stepped up attacks since President Mohamud took office in May and pledged an all-out war against the group. President Mohamud, with support from the United States and allied local militia, has launched an offensive against the group, although results have been limited. The House of the People on Monday postponed a planned sitting of the House following the daring and puzzling Al-Shabaab attack targeting a hotel near Parliament. The targeted area is one of the most heavily guarded parts of Mogadishu, and senior government officials were rescued from the hotel.
Somalia's parliament on Monday postponed a scheduled session as gunfire could still be heard inside a besieged Mogadishu hotel. Gunfire was still heard from the Villa Rosa Hotel near the presidential residence on Monday. The Villa Rose was invaded last night at around 8 p.m. by fighters from Al-Shabaab, an Al-Qaeda-linked armed group, using guns and explosives, with police saying at the time that the government officials escaped from its windows. Special Forces units known as Gashan and Harma'ad had taken over operations, a police officer at the scene said on condition of anonymity. The number of casualties from the siege and the number of people rescued was not yet clear. Government officials in Mogadishu frequently use the Villa Rosa Hotel after meetings. The House of the People of the Federal Government of Somalia officially resumed sittings mid this month after a 2-month recess. The sitting was the second of the assembly, which went for a break shortly after electing the President of the Republic of Somalia and approving the Prime Minister and his cabinet. Somalia's parliament said it had postponed a scheduled session for both of its houses. The hotel is just adjacent to the National Assembly and Villa Somalia, which houses the President and the Prime Minister. Al-Shabaab, which is seeking to topple the government and establish its own rule based on an extreme interpretation of Islamic law, frequently stages attacks in Mogadishu and elsewhere. Al-Shabaab fighters carry out such attacks in Mogadishu and other parts of the Horn of African nation. The attack comes as the government is engaged in an all-war against Al-Shabaab militant group. The new strategy, in place since July, has already led to some gains in 2 regions in central Somalia. Since 2007, the Al-Qaeda affiliated group has been fighting the government and trying to establish Islamic law in the country. The group has carried out numerous attacks in retaliation to the offensives carried by the Somali National Army and allied local militia group and international partners in many parts of the country. The deadliest attack by the group on October 29, targeting the busy Sobe junction, led to the death of more than 120 people, while 333 others were wounded.
Students of Somerville who are set to graduate today will now have to wait until the 6th of December for the ceremony marking the end of their graduation. The graduations, which were planned for Monday, were cut short following an Al-Shabaab attack at a hotel near the National Theatre, where the graduation was set to be held.
Officials of a university in Mogadishu have cancelled a graduation ceremony for the safety of graduating students. Over 500 students from Somerville University in Mogadishu suspended their graduation on Monday to avoid putting the students' lives at risk. A brief session of the program commenced, but the institution's management decided to postpone the graduation to a later date. The event was to be graced by senior officials of the Somali government, according to sources that spoke to Dalsan TV. The graduation ceremony was being held at the National Theatre, which is close to Villa Rose Hotel, which was attacked by members of the militant group Al-Shabaab. The graduation ceremony has now been postponed to December 4th, according to the management of Somerville University. Over 500 students from civil engineering, petroleum engineering, computer science, public health, nutrition science, nursing science, laboratory science, midwifery, medicine and surgery, public administration, business administration, international relations and diplomacy, accounting and finance, economics and management were among the graduates expected to conclude their education today. Hundreds of guests, including students, parents, government officials, federal MPs, local and international education institutions, foreign diplomats and the media were also invited to attend the event. The management of the school said the decision to postpone the program involved consultations with the Ministry of Education, the management of the National Theatre and Somali Security Services. Somerville University is a non-profit, non-governmental educational institution. Somerville is a multi-campus university whose jurisdiction of teaching extends to the area comprising of Benadir, Jubaland, Somaliland, Puntland, Hirshabelle State, Southwest State and Galmudug State. The university has created a reputation in the field of health sciences, engineering, humanities and law. The targeted hotel, Villa Rose website describes the hotel as the most secure lodging arrangements in Mogadishu, with metal detectors and a high perimeter wall. Al-Shabaab has intensified attacks against civilian and military targets as Somalia's recently elected government has pursued a policy of all-out war against the Al-Shabaab. The security forces, backed by local militias, armies and US airstrikes, have driven Al-Shabaab from central parts of Somalia in recent months, but the offensive has drawn retribution. President Hassan Sheikh Mohamud, who was elected this year, has launched a military offensive against the group.
The UN office in Somalia called for more protection for women and girls during the humanitarian crisis as the country struggles with one of the worst droughts in history. Humanitarian and development actors have been asked together to provide an enabling legal and socio-political environment that encourages women and girls to participate and benefit equally from development activities.
The United Nations Support Office for Somalia has called for more protection of women and girls in the country struggling with various humanitarian challenges.
Civil society organizations and community members, as well as
marking the global 16 days of activism against gender-based violence, the United Nations in Somalia has called for redoubling of efforts to prevent and address violence against women and girls. The officer in charge of the United Nations Assistant Mission in Somalia, Anita Kiki-Gebo, said in a statement sent to newsrooms that the ongoing humanitarian crisis and conflict in Somalia have displaced large populations and put women and girls at greater risk of violence, including sexual violence, gender-based violence, and conflict-related sexual violence, severely impacting on the right to life, livelihood, dignity of women and girls. Mrs. Gebo in her statement added, making humanitarian response more gender inclusive and creating a safer environment for women and girls are critical. The theme for this year's campaign is Unite Activism to End Violence Against Women and Girls, highlights the urgent need to come together and prevent violence against women and girls. Ending discrimination on all grounds, including gender, is stipulated in Somalia's Provisional Constitution of 2012. The United Nations in Somalia has urged Parliament to adopt the Sexual Offences Bill, which will offer greater protection of the victims of sexual violence across the country. The United Nations in Somalia has urged Parliament to adopt the Sexual Offences Bill, which will offer greater protection of the victims of sexual violence across the country. The annual 16 Days of Activism Against Gender-Based Violence campaign, which runs from 25th November, the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women, to 10th December, the Human Rights Day, is a reminder of the unfinished work to realize gender equality, peace and security for all in every sphere of life, including in public and political spheres. During the 16-day campaign, the UN will join hands with the Somali government and civil society organizations in advocacy and awareness-raising activities to address violence against women. Girls and women in Somalia say rape and other forms of sexual and gender-based violence are rising as the country faces its worst drought in 40 years. Amid fears that pockets of the country are at risk of famine, child rights organizations have warned that girls and young women are caught in a double crisis of hunger and violence, as 4 successful failed rainy seasons have left their families and communities struggling to cope.
UN Human Rights Chief Volker Turk has called for an independent investigation into ongoing deadly violence against protesters in Iran, where security forces have used live ammunition, birdshot, and other metal pellets, tear gas, and batons.
It pains me to see what is happening in the country. The images of children killed, of women beaten in the streets, of people sentenced to death.
The commissioner highlighted how the security forces, notably the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and Basij forces, who have used live ammunition against the protest movement as it has spread into a reported 150 cities and 140 universities in all provinces of Iran.
My office has received multiple communications from the government on the events, including domestic investigations into Mrs. Amini's death. We remain concerned that the investigations have failed to meet international standards of impartiality, independence, and transparency.
And those are some of our top stories for this hour. This is Dalsan TV English broadcast with me, Hibak Ahmed. Till we meet again, enjoy the rest of the viewing.